Hey everyone, I wanted to hop on here and do a quick little Q&A. There was a really great question that was left on one of my YouTube videos, the one on what is research, where I talk about how I simply define research and how there are four key parts. You have to ask a question, you have to make an intentional plan to answer that question, you have to collect information following that plan, and then lastly, you have to use that information you collected to answer the question you asked right back at the beginning. So in that video, I also talk a little bit about the difference between research and evaluation and how, in my opinion, they're honestly, for the most part, the same thing. And you can check out the video to learn more, but to summarize it really quickly, I talk about how the real big difference, typically when you talk about research versus evaluation, is that people say, research is to contribute to the general knowledge base. So it's to move from beyond like your specific context, your place, what you studied, so that other people can apply it to the broader context, like so that there are learnings for everyone. And evaluation, on the other hand, is thought about in a little bit like smaller, more narrow terms, right? Like you're learning if something worked or didn't work, and that knowledge is just for you and the thing you're evaluating. My point is that even when you do an evaluation, I think you want other people to be able to learn from it. So don't you hope that your learnings from the evaluation are contributing to the broader base of knowledge that other people can use that too? Yes. So then why isn't it research? And what it comes down to is in that case, it's not research, because if you're doing research, you have to go through an institutional review board. And right now, that's not something that's available to everyone. So we call some things evaluation, we call some things research. To me, should really be following the same steps, regardless of which word you are using. So the question that was asked was around the four paradigms of research that are talked about by Meritons and also by Wilson and some other really interesting scholars. And so they talk about four different paradigms of research. And what this person was wondering was if there was any insight or advice I had for differentiating between these four paradigms and for choosing which approach to take during research. So I thought that was a great question. I was really excited to get it. And so let's talk a little bit about that. First things first, I just want to briefly touch on the word paradigm, because one of the things I'm committed to is not using a lot of jargon, and I would consider paradigm to be jargony. So what is a paradigm? A paradigm is basically an example or a pattern or a model framework, right? A paradigm can be used to explain a broader concept, right? Or to make sense of a lot of different things in a more simplified way. So for instance, when you think about four paradigms of research, lots of people have done research. It can be tricky to talk about the hundreds of thousands of research studies that have ever happened all together. However, if you go through those different research studies, you start to find some trends, some themes, some things that they have in common in terms of how they made choices and how they approached the research. And so if you do the work of analysis, of analyzing and digging into all of that, you can develop something like a paradigm, which is a simple, streamlined way to make sense of larger buckets of work. So in this case, these researchers have come up with four paradigms for research and evaluation. And let's dig into them, and I will give you my simplified take on them and talk a little bit about how to decide which one or more than one you want to use in your work. So, four research and evaluation paradigms that are discussed in this comment are post-positivist, constructivist, pragmatic, and transformative. I'm going to link a scholarly article below that you can read if you want to read more about them, because information, knowledge is power. And if you're interested in this, I would love for you to be able to read more about it and see who they cite and just learn as much as you can. So let's start with the first one, post-positivist. Post-positivist is a paradigm that's mainly focused on your methods choices. And so methods is how you're collecting information, data, how you're analyzing the information data. And post-positivists use a quantitative approach. So they're looking at numbers. And this is because they're striving to find a truth that is independent of the observer. So they're looking for a truth that is just like true for anyone, no matter what. Like, it doesn't matter that I'm seeing it or you're seeing it. Like, there is just an objective truth that is true, and we're going to find it using numbers. And a lot of people tend to think that numbers are more objective rather than, that's just like, well, that's the number that's on it, so it must be true. So post-positivist is seeking truth, independent truth, and they are using numbers, quantitative methods. Constructivists, on the other hand, view the researcher as the instrument. So that means that as the researcher, you are shaping the methods, the data, the findings. Like, you have this relationship with them. It matters who you are. It matters what your perspectives are. And constructivism is about identifying these different perspectives. And so it's almost like the idea that there could be multiple truths, and my truth could look different than your truth, right? And the way they would find this would largely be through qualitative methods. So through voice, text, stories, not numbers, right? So constructivist is I, the researcher, I'm an instrument, and I'm using qualitative data to identify different perspectives. Pragmatic paradigm is about how data is used, and it's about the data being useful to stakeholders. And so stakeholders can be considered people who are like maybe the people who you're collecting data from, the people who are going to use the data, the people who the data and the decisions that come from the data can impact. Those are all stakeholders. So pragmatic paradigm, what matters there is that the information is actually useful. And in many cases, this can be mixed methods, which means you use some quantitative, some qualitative, some numbers, some stories, you combine it, use them in a way that they complement each other and is practical, pragmatic, practical. Lastly, we have the transformative paradigm. And the transformative paradigm is something that I know I've been hearing a lot more about recently, which I think is exciting. And it's really centered around social justice and recognizing that research and evaluation are about power, and that the power dynamics at play in research and evaluation are important to consider, and that it's important to design your study or evaluation in a way that is ethical and considers equity and diverse perspectives. And in this case, also in a way that allows you to transform the status quo. So like change the world, do things differently, change how things are done. Transformative is about transforming, right? And it often also uses mixed methods. So as you can kind of tell from these like brief little descriptions, these paradigms are not mutually exclusive. So if something's mutually exclusive with something else, that means that if you're one, you can't be the other. And if you go through these paradigms, you could have research and evaluation that reflects all four of them, right? The post-positivist gets a little trickier to get in there just because it's so quantitative, so independent truth, but I still think there are aspects of that belief system there that you could do a study that involves all four of these at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. And so I think that's important to consider, is that you don't have to just choose one. So in thinking about how to choose your approach you take to research, I want to share something that I learned in graduate school and that I still think about. And that is that you should let your questions drive the methods, which means when you're deciding the paradigm to use or picking the tools you're going to use or deciding how you're going to analyze data, the question that you're seeking an answer to, the question that you're investigating, that is what should drive your choice. You don't start out and say, I'm going to do constructivist research and I'm going to, do a case study and I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do post-positivist research and I'm going to do a hierarchical linear modeling. You wouldn't do that because it's like, well, like, how do you know that those are the right approaches given the question you have? Like, don't predetermine how you're going to answer the question. Pick the question first and then think through, what is the best way to answer this question? What's the best way to collect information? What's the best way to analyze information so that I can have an answer to this question that I trust and that is accurate and that is thorough? That's the order you want to go in. So really start with the question that you have. And I also think it's important to layer in there the context, right? Because sometimes if you're studying and you're looking at we're going to collect data from 10,000 people, it can be really hard to do qualitative data analysis. You might not have the resources in terms of time or money or know-how to do all of that. So there are other factors like contextual factors that shape how you answer that question. But at the end of the day, the best way you know how to answer that question, that's what should be driving the paradigm that you draw from, the methods that you're choosing, the approach that you're taking. The other thing I want to mention is that, in my opinion, all research and evaluation needs to be two things. It needs to be pragmatic, like it needs to be practical. It needs to be useful. Why are we doing research if the information can't be used? I don't know. I don't know. I think it's important that you are doing research and evaluation that is useful and meaningful to the people involved in that work, the people impacted by that work. So to me, pragmatic is always very top of mind. Similarly, transformative, this idea that research is power. I really believe that research and evaluation is power, and it can dictate whose voice is heard and who gets money. And it's something that we have to recognize about research. And when we are building research and evaluation studies, to intentionally build in that aspect of being inclusive of different viewpoints and experiences and creating space for people to be heard and really pushing back on systems that are racist and sexist and outdated. Like, we have an opportunity to do that with research. So don't not recognize that. Don't let that opportunity go to waste. I think that there is this moral aspect of doing research, like moral, like what is right for people in the world. And in my opinion, being practically helpful and also being human-centered, inclusive in your design are critical, right? So that's two of them right there, two paradigms I think you should always be thinking of. And then when it comes to the constructivist and the post-positivist, all the studies that I work on are mixed methods to some extent. There's debate over what can really be considered mixed methods, because it's not supposed to just be checking off the box of having numbers and stories, quantitative and qualitative. But I really am an advocate of bringing that mixed methods lens to your work if it answers your question. I think a lot of times the qualitative can add more context and nuance and understanding. And it's really important to have that. And so when I think about how all my work can include both constructivists and post-positivists, what I think about is this. I, as I said earlier, I think the researcher is the instrument. I think that's really important to acknowledge the role that you and your beliefs and your experiences play in the work that you're doing. So that's constructivist right there, right? recognizing that and seeking different perspectives in your work. I think that's really important, which kind of makes it seem like, okay, so it's never post-positivist, right? It's never, but I think the essence whereby you are looking for truth, like the spirit of that, I don't think is at odds with everything else that I'm saying. Like, I want to look for truth too. I just recognize that we should be looking at truth from different perspectives. So I think that the sentiment there is something you can incorporate. I think that quantitative methods can be very quick and useful, and can sometimes, there are times when they can be more objective. For instance, if I want to do a study of how tall people are, I would much rather measure people than ask them to self-report it, right? So there is a place there too. Again, depends on what your question is, but no matter what your question is, I hope that you're striving to be inclusive and practical as you design your research and evaluation. So I hope this was helpful. This was really fun to do. I don't get to dig into the philosophy aspect of this very often. So I really appreciate you asking the question, and hope this gave you something to think about.